started our rollout of Sega Saturn yesterday. Our retail price is between $399 and $449.
$299. What exactly happened to the Sega Saturn?
The Saturn's ill-conceived Western launch.
Not just a single console failure, but the beginning of the end for Sega's hardware empire.
It failed to capture the attention of gamers and was ultimately a commercial failure.
The rise and fall of the Sega Saturn.
Let's talk about the Sega Saturn and what went wrong.
The Sega Saturn, a failed console right before the Dreamcast. Countless videos on YouTube about why Saturn failed, why Sega failed. You know, Sega failed, Sega failed, Sega failed.
What went wrong with the Sega Saturn? What went wrong?
It would be an understatement to say that the Sega Saturn is enjoying a retro renaissance right now. In fact, as someone who first picked up and played the Sega Saturn almost 30 years ago, it feels like the console is finally now being given a chance by gamers thanks to a thriving retro gaming community. However, as more and more people discover the Saturn, it's natural that they'll turn to YouTube for information on the system and its games, and for me, that's where there's a breakdown in the experience. When it comes to Sega Saturn content on YouTube, there is a wealth of videos on why the Saturn failed, and look, we get it. Negativity sells. In fact, I accept right now that when making this video, I'm pretty much screaming into the storm hoping to be heard. But along with our brothers at Sega Saturn Shiro, we are determined to try and change the narrative, to create content that matches the current day positivity around Saturn in the community. Saturn Dave recently shared posts with me from a retro gaming section of Reddit, complaining about videos and content that claimed the Saturn was a great console or even a great platform, going as far as to label content like this as revisionist. Now listen, the Saturn's failure is part of its story. We aren't trying to rewrite history here. We know that Sega messed up and made bad decisions. We were there, we lived through it, but in 2024, it's not what we should be focusing on when we're discussing the Saturn. I mean, this guy called Knights a Looper clone that's less impressive than Star Fox on the SNES. Really? The Saturn may well have been a commercial failure, but it wasn't a failure to us where it mattered, as our games console. For us, it was a success. It succeeded in giving us hundreds of hours of fun. It succeeded in strengthening friendships and making new ones. It succeeded in creating memories that would go on to last a lifetime. It succeeded in living on in the hearts and minds of Sega fans who are just as passionate about it 30 years on. Sales numbers are not the only metric of success, unless of course that's what matters most to you, but I've never been one for popularity contests. It's ridiculous that there's an opinion that low sales equals bad games. Every system, irrespective of their commercial performance, has good games in its library. Back in the 90s as teenagers, we didn't give a shit how many Saturns had been sold. We were too busy playing the games. Of course we were aware that games were drying up in the latter years, and we knew that our console wasn't the most popular, but that didn't matter to us. Now, some of you may be thinking, he's just said he's not trying to rewrite history, but he's opened this video with a flashy message about changing the narrative. But changing a narrative doesn't mean rewriting history or denying it. When it comes to YouTube content, the Saturn is fighting against several prevalent narratives. That it was a poor console with bad games, that it was underpowered and not worth playing, that its games are too expensive to bother trying, and that new content that mentions the system must be prefixed with its commercial performance, despite being discontinued 26 years ago. It's these narratives that we want to change, and we will continue to fight and try and change. The console wars of the 5th generation are over. All that's left now are the games to be enjoyed and discovered. Some people seem to get oddly annoyed at hearing others enjoy the Saturn, again feeding into the failure narrative. And if you don't like the Sega Saturn, that's absolutely your choice, but keep in mind that there are many of us who had great gaming memories on this console. Is it so bad that we want to share them? We didn't have a Saturn community back in the day, so in a way we're making up for lost time thanks to the wonders of the internet and a global connected retro gaming audience. The fact is, people who use commercial performance as Saturn's only metric of success in 2024 are blind. Look around the retro gaming community, guys. Sega Saturn is still out there. And look, I'm not here to say that the Sega Saturn is something that it's not. Of course it's got its own unique flaws, but in a way, that's part of why we love it. I love this system. I love the experiences that it's given me and the memories that it's created. I love that almost 30 years on, I've made new friendships on the other side of the world because of Sega Saturn. In fact, there wouldn't even be a Sega Guys if it wasn't for the Sega Saturn and the bond that it created between Dan the Mega Driver and I. And of course, I love the community that the Saturn has fostered over the years, and we owe it to them, we owe it to you, Saturn fans old and new, to give you guys content that matches the positivity around the system in the present day. I'm James the SEGAHolic of the Sega Guys, and amongst an ocean of what Saturn did wrong videos, in this episode I'm going to tell you everything the Sega Saturn did right. Well, the Dreamcast has carved a niche as a console ahead of its time and has a library full of incredible games. The Saturn is where Sega's creative forces cut their teeth, taking risks while learning on the job. The result was games the likes of which we had never seen before. Nights into Dreams, Sonic Team's incredible fusion of flight and arcade squad attack gameplay, set in a dream world where players gather enough energy to defeat Wiseman, save Nightopia, and turn Clarice and Elliot's nightmares into sweet dreams. It launched with the 3D analogue controller, allowing for a freedom of movement in-game that we had never felt before. Burning Rangers, another Sonic Team title where you take on the role of a rookie firefighter, battling blazes, traversing platforms, solving puzzles and rescuing survivors. Burning Rangers features an in-game navigation system, allowing players to radio back to HQ for instructions and directions during play. Panzer Dragoon by Team Andromeda may be a real shooter at heart, but it ushered in a level of cinematic presentation not seen before in console gaming. Utilising cinematic CGI cutscenes to tell the story before and in between stages, the act of controlling your dragon along a preset path felt immersive and like it had purpose. The soundtrack, outsourced to Yoshitaka Azuma, was composed once the game was complete, allowing the music to seemingly react to what was happening on screen, further enhancing that cinematic feel. Deep Fear may look like a generic Resident Evil clone at first glance, but it took Capcom's formula of survival horror, exploration and tank controls and fused it with a twist of its own. The game is set on the underwater research facility called Big Table, and players must not only fight for survival, but to breathe. The oxygen supply on Big Table is depleting all the time, and it runs out even faster when weapons are fired. Dragon Force, created by Sega CS, is cited as one of the games to show the real power of the Saturn, and is a tactical RPG where players can end up in control of vast armies with hundreds of sprites drawn on screen at once. And it wasn't just Sega's teams who got creative. The Saturn was a canvas for other developers too, with games like Treasure's Guardian Heroes, Hudson Soft's Bulk Slash, and Kenji Eno's Enemy Zero all bringing a unique flavour to the Saturn's library. Of course, a frequent argument is that many of the Saturn's best games were only released in Japan, and while that may be a true statement, it doesn't mean that we just overlook them when discussing what the system did well. Are we meant to just ignore good games because they didn't come out in the West? No, of course not. They exist, they show what the system could do, and they matter. Sega was always at the bleeding edge of arcade technology, none more so than in the 90s, as games transitioned from 2D to 3D at breakneck pace. Model 1's flat shaded polygons ushered in lifelike human movement in Virtua Fighter, but it would be the Model 2 board and its texture mapped polygons that would provide the Saturn with its most impressive 3D games. Throughout the Saturn's life, Sega ported some of its biggest and best Model 2 games to the system, some with better results than others, but it was still incredible to see these games come into the home and, in most cases, replicate the gameplay experience from the arcade. There's no better example of this than the trio of games which would go on to be affectionately known as the Big Three, with Virtua Fighter 2, Sega Rally and Virtua Cop all releasing within weeks of one another. I can't put into words just how insane it was to see these games running in your home at this level on a console. As someone who played in the local arcade at weekends back in the day, it was quite a feeling to walk in, see these games and know that you could go home and play incredible versions in your bedroom. Virtual On, Last Bronx, Virtua Cop 2, Fighting Vipers, Sega Touring Car, Manx TT Superbike and House of the Dead all made their way across to Saturn, although Manx TT and House of the Dead were outsourced to Tantalus, who also worked on the Saturn version of both Wipeout games. Manx TT is a sensational port, albeit limited in terms of content, not that that harmed Ridge Racer, and while House of the Dead looks rough, beneath the pixelated mess of its textures, the gameplay of the arcade version shines through. And although often criticised today, the original Saturn port of Daytona USA remains an enjoyable and incredibly playable experience due to its superb handling physics that absolutely nails the feel of the arcade. Oddly enough, Saturn's 3D performance is also something downplayed in comparison with PlayStation, but the reality is that the very best 3D titles on PlayStation, you know, the ones that people use to beat Saturn's 3D performance, didn't actually release until 1998, those being Tekken 3, Metal Gear Solid and Gran Turismo. Sega's Big Three, mentioned earlier, released in late 1995 and early 1996, depending on which region you lived in, and were as good as it got in terms of cutting edge 3D visuals in the home. There was nothing on PS1 that could touch Virtua Fighter 2 for example, and it took until Tekken 3, again 1998, to come close, releasing almost 2.5 years later. However, Saturn didn't just receive ports from more advanced arcade boards, it also formed the basis of the Sega Titan video board, with games like Virtua Fighter Remix, Die Hard Arcade, Athlete Kings and Treasures Radiant Silvergun appearing in arcades, and ported to Saturn with a fast turnaround. The advantage of the Titan board is that it provided Saturn with near one-to-one ports of arcade versions of these games. The notion that Saturn couldn't do 3D is as ridiculous now as it was back then, and these games are proof that, in the right hands, Saturn could replicate the gameplay experience of the very best the arcade had to offer. When it comes to 2D, the Saturn was king of the 5th generation. And sure, in the trenches of the console war of the mid-90s, many gamers and even most gaming media failed to see past the excitement and the newness of 3D polygonal games in the home. However, as the decades have passed and the dust has settled, 2D has proven timeless, with appreciation for 2D games at an all-time high. Whether running on a stock Saturn system or with an expanded RAM cartridge, the Saturn throws sprites around the screen with ease, leading to some utterly fantastic arcade ports and original games. Capcom were prolific on Saturn, with the very best of their CPS2 games coming to Saturn in near arcade perfect form. X-Men Children of the Atom, X-Men vs Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, the amazing Street Fighter Alpha Trilogy, Vampire Savior, Darkstalkers Revenge and Cyberbot's Full Metal Madness are all best on Saturn. Successes Incredible Cotton 2 and Treasure's Silhouette Mirage provided arcade shooter fans with plenty to keep them busy. SNK showed the Saturn plenty of love too, with ports of their King of Fighters and Fatal Fury games, as well as legendary shooter Metal Slug. We also had brilliant original 2D games like Sega's Own a Stall and JVC's KO Flying Squadron 2. I could easily dedicate a whole video to 2D games on the Saturn, not only because of their quantity, but their sheer quality. When any of these games came to PS1, the experience paled in comparison, with longer load times, slowdown, inconsistent frame rates and even missing animations. That means that gamers who come to these 2D classics today are getting the best experience on the Saturn. When Dan the Mega Driver and I met at Arcade Club in Bury last year, it was great fun going round the various Astro City cabinets and playing these 2D arcade titles, and not just that, seeing how much gamers were still enjoying them today. And while I still get somewhat annoyed at Saturn's 3D capabilities being downplayed by some even today, there's no denying the legacy of its 2D performance, as gamers young and old continue to enjoy and appreciate these 2D games decades later. As I mentioned earlier, one of the arguments thrown back in your face about the Saturn when you mention its game library is that the best of it is locked away in Japan. As I said, it's a weak argument, because these games exist. Even if we didn't get to play them in the 1990s, they're still part of the wider Saturn picture. However, in 2024, it's never been easier to access the wealth of riches the Sega Saturn library has to offer. Of course, Saturn collecting is an expensive hobby these days, and while you can easily have a great Saturn experience on a small budget, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, the rarer titles do cost a ridiculous amount of money, but again, those prices are no longer a barrier of entry. Thanks to the talented minds of the community, we now have several optical drive emulators to choose from that allow Saturn fans old and new to experience the entire library, as well as the increasing number of homebrew titles the community is working on, including English translations, original games and mods. I've already touched on the incredible 2D fighters from Capcom and SNK, such as X-Men vs Street Fighter and Real Bout Fatal Fury Special. But other games like Elevator Action Returns, Cotton 2, Grandia, Dragon Force 2, Police Knots, Sokyu Gerentai, Bulk Slash, Street Fighter 03 and Astra Superstars are among some of the very best the Saturn has to offer from its Japanese library. In fact, if you're a fan of bullet hell shooters, the Saturn is a dream console, with games like Batsugen, Dodonpachi, Lair Section, Thunder Force 5, Blastwind, Battle Garega, and of course Radiant Silvergun, to name just a few. And if you're a fan of RPGs, the Saturn has you covered and then some. There's thousands of hours of storytelling, spellcasting, exploration and battles to enjoy. Panzer Dragoon Saga, Shining the Holy Ark, Dark Saviour, Shining Wisdom and Shining Force 3 are some of the very best the genre has to offer, with many of the best Japanese RPGs also now fully translated in English. Games like Grandia, Shining Force 3 Scenarios 2 and 3 and Dragon Force 2 are now fully playable in English on your Saturn. While many of the Saturn's bigger and best known games have made their way to other platforms, there are still many great titles still exclusive to the system, and there's never been a better time to visit Saturn and try them out. Many of these games perfectly capture the spirit of the Saturn, providing a unique gameplay experience. Friends of mine who have picked up a Saturn in recent years have described the library as an Aladdin's cave due to the size of the library and the multitude of exclusive games. Let's take a look at some of the amazing games you can still only play on Sega Saturn. One of the criticisms the Saturn faced is that the console was difficult to get the most out of due to its complex system architecture. And while there's no denying that that was a case for many third-party developers, the claim is somewhat at odds with Sega's own internal teams who got the absolute best out of the Saturn, some with and some without the use of the Sega graphics library. However, within the Saturn's architecture lies two video display processors, or VDPs, and its VDP2, which is the jewel in the Saturn's crown, a processor that even John Lineman himself told us was the Saturn's secret sauce. While most graphics chipset rely on a single chip to process foreground and backgrounds, Saturn splits this task in two, with VDP1 handling foreground tasks, namely sprites, quads and textures, while VDP2 handles background graphics, working in tandem with VDP1. VDP2 is based on Sega's System 32 technology, and can draw large 2D background planes as well as larger 3D textured infinite planes for objects like walls, ceilings, skies and oceans. VDP2 is also capable of several visual effects, such as full transparencies, something VDP1 is incapable of, as seen by the Saturn's infamous mesh effect transparencies. Many third-party developers simply didn't understand how to utilise VDP1 and VDP2 in tandem, and those who did figure it out did so when it was too late. The Saturn version of Tomb Raider, for example, is running almost exclusively on VDP1, essentially running on a fraction of the Saturn's power. VDP2 can utilise multi-texturing, essentially applying a transparent overlay on a VDP1 polygon object, as seen in the shields in Sonic R, as well as the Radiant Emerald track in the same game. VDP2 can draw 3D infinite planes up to a resolution of 4096 by 4096 pixels, with a fill rate of 500 megapixels per second, absolutely crushing the performance of any console or PC at that time. For gamers though, VDP2's impact can be seen on the likes of Grandia, which on Saturn uses VDP2 to draw much more detailed environments, better water effects and ground textures compared to the PlayStation version. Shadows on the Saturn version of Grandia are also more detailed. In fact, some are simply missing on PlayStation, and in areas which cast a shadow on the Saturn version, the character models fade as they step into the shaded area. Now, Grandia was built from the ground up for Saturn and then ported to PlayStation, highlighting that when a game was made properly for Saturn, utilising that dual VDP architecture, its results couldn't be replicated on PlayStation. Other games where VDP2's impact is noticeable are on the stages of Panzer Dragoon Zwei with its draw distance that never ends, Last Bronx with the ceiling in Yoko's subway stage, and the beautiful canyon floors of Panzer Dragoon Saga with their transparent water that show rock formations protruding from the surface. VDP2 was an insanely powerful chipset for the time, providing Saturn with a unique set of visual effects that went painfully underused by many developers. However, in games where VDP1 and VDP2 are used to their full potential, the results are phenomenal, and are an example of the uniqueness in console design that made the 5th generation such an exciting time to be a gamer. Gamers don't think twice about their console being online in the modern day. It's part and parcel of the experience, with multiplayer gaming, digital stores, downloadable content and much more. But in the 90s, it wasn't common at all. Sega had tried to take the Mega Drive online via the Mega Modem in 1990, but was confined to Japan and certain parts of Asia. With Saturn, however, Sega released the Sega Saturn modem in Japan in July of 1996, which would go on to become the Netlink modem released in North America later that same year.
One of the top dogs for Sega, Michael Rivero, has been kind enough to stop by and give us the inside scoop to this Netlink. What's up with this?
It's probably one of the coolest things we've ever done. A lot of people have talked about this network access device, this network computer that was going to retail for $500. The big guys have been talking about it, but it took a game company, it took Sega to make it happen. The Sega Saturn Netlink will retail for under $450, and it'll give people all over the world the ability to access the internet.
Well, wait a second. So if I don't have a computer, will I be able to access the internet?
Absolutely. You'll be able to do everything you can do on a computer, plus something that you can't do right now for under $2,000. and that's play games over the internet.
The Japanese modem is grey in colour and utilises X-band technology to connect. Interestingly, the modem cartridge features a telephone card slot on the right hand side. These were used to load prepaid cards to access the network for a set period of time. These cards came with game artwork including Sega Rally and, strangely, Virtua Fighter 2. I say strangely because while Sega Rally has an online version on Saturn, Virtua Fighter 2 doesn't. Do these cards suggest that online play was planned for VF2 but scrapped? Or were Sega just tapping into the insane popularity of VF2 at the time and using these cards as some kind of advertising? In terms of game support, the Japanese service has far more choice, but several major Saturn titles made their way online, including Daytona USA Circuit Edition, Virtual On, Decathlete aka Athlete Kings, Sega Worldwide Soccer 98, Duke Nukem 3D, Saturn Bomberman and Virtua Fighter Remix. This year we purchased 2 Sega Saturn modem kits from our brothers at Sega Saturn Shiro. These kits were unused and sold as a job lot, made available to Patreon members of a certain tier. The kit includes the Sega Saturn web browser disc, a copy of Pad Nifty, and a copy of Virtua Fighter Remix for SegaNet, which can't be bought separately. The kits also included a USB line voltage modem, allowing us to access Sega RPG Fan's tunnel script to dial directly to another Saturn gamer on the same setup using IP addresses. We've got plenty of netlink coverage on the channel right now, showing Dan and I playing one another online on real Sega Saturn hardware, with games like Virtual On, Virtua Fighter Remix and Worldwide Soccer 98 being incredibly lag free and like we were playing one another sitting in the same room. The US Netlink and Japanese SegaNet games have now been patched and work with both versions of the modem, although you'll need an optical drive emulator or a mod chip that enables the playing of burned discs to access them. Cartridge based methods of using burned discs aren't an option here, as your console's cartridge slot is taken up by the modem. It's incredible to see the Sega Saturn online in 2024, with the community growing more and more all the time. But can you imagine what it would have been like back in the day to see this in action in 1996? Now, we didn't get Netlink in the UK, and while Dreamcast is praised for having online connectivity right out the box, the Saturn had a perfectly playable and enjoyable online service years before, featuring some of the biggest and best games on the system. This for me would have been a game changer had Sega been able to roll this out globally back in the day.
Wow, so wait, let me get this straight. So I'll be able to play games with my little brother back east?
Absolutely.
Living out here?
Yeah, you'll be able to play games with your little brother back east. You'll be able to play games with people all across in Europe and Asia. It's that kind of system. Hey.
Created by Kenji Tosaka, the man behind the Virtua Gun bundled with Virtua Cop, the 3D controller was designed specifically to accompany Nights into Dreams. However, it was compatible with many other games, including Sega Touring Car, Manx TT Superbike, Wipeout 2097 and Sega Rally, provided you owned the Japanese Plus Edition or the US Netlink Edition. The top section of the controller disconnects from the main unit, revealing a multi-purpose connector. Tosaka-san's patents show various add-on ideas using this port, including trackpads, second screens, motion controllers, clocks and even a stand to turn the controller into a steering wheel. Ultimately, the lack of uptake on the controller led to none of these patents becoming a reality, but several of them can be seen in the Dreamcast controller with the 2 expansion ports for VMUs and Rumble Packs. When you pick up a 3D controller today, they remain incredibly accurate with no stick drift, unless of course there's actual physical damage to the unit. The reason for this is the proprietary chipset inside the controller, which measures inputs on the stick to deliver optimal accuracy. The controller also features analogue triggers, allowing for players to have more control over acceleration and braking in driving games, another first for a controller of that generation. Some have argued that Sega should have made this the packaged controller with the console, while others believe that the lack of a second analogue stick would have aged it prematurely once the DualShock came around on PlayStation. One thing is for sure though, in that while the Saturn's 3D controller heavily influenced the design and the feature set of the Dreamcast controller, the Saturn's pad remains vastly superior. 6 face buttons, a better D-pad and a larger analogue stick make the Saturn controller more complete in terms of functionality, and most of all, it's still incredible fun to use even today. The one thing I hope I've shown in this video is how good a games console the Sega Saturn is. I really hope that I've done it proud, and I hope that fans of the system have enjoyed and appreciate what I've tried to do here. The wave of negative content around Saturn, a lot of it legacy content from years gone by on YouTube, is what inspired me to make this video, because I really felt that the narrative being spun just didn't match up with my own experience and the experiences of those I know personally who grew up with the Saturn. The Saturn had amazing games. No. Scratch that. It has amazing games. And I'm certain that if people sit down with an open mind and just play Sega Saturn, they'll find something to enjoy. In this video, I wanted to put across how much the system means to me and the impact it's had on me as a gamer. With the gaming landscape the way it is today, super consoles capable of 4K resolutions, ray tracing and other various graphical techniques, it's really hard to put into words to someone who wasn't around what it was like to own and play Saturn when it was new. We really did feel like we were on the bleeding edge of gaming technology as we explored tombs, fought fires, rode dragons and seen the latest and greatest from the arcade come into our homes. Much is made today of the difference between Saturn and PlayStation in terms of graphical performance, but trust me guys, back in the mid-90s we never felt like Saturn was less powerful or inferior. It was just different, unique in its own way. The Sega Saturn was one of the things that me and my best friend Sam had in common. We both owned the system, we both bought Sega Saturn magazine every month, we pored over every page, chatting about it during break time at school. On weekends, we'd walk the near 6-mile round trip to a local indie store called CA Games just to see the latest Saturn arrivals. Now we couldn't afford to buy many games of our own at that time, but just seeing them, holding them and trying them out was enough. It really was a great time in my life, and if I could go back in time and do that walk one more time with Sam, chatting about Sega Saturn, sharing the excitement of the games that we just could not wait to play, talking over the reviews and the articles from Sega Saturn magazine, I'm telling you what guys, I'd do it again in a heartbeat. YouTube has a lot to answer for when it comes to Saturn content, and in a sea of clinical, clickbait, soulless, negative analysis, I hope that what I've managed to do here is inject a bit of passion, some personal perspective, and maybe inspire others to tell their stories and do the same. If you've made it to the end of this video guys, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this one. This has been James the SEGAHolic of the Sega Guys. Until next time, we will see you on the Sega side.